introduction. My name is Lincoln Hobbs. I'm an attorney practicing primarily in Salt Lake City, Utah, licensed in Idaho and Wyoming as well. And the vast majority of my practice for about the last 10 years has been in representing community associations of all types. And you talked this morning about the various types of community associations. That's been important in the various sessions we've had today, and it's going to be very important for your rulemaking to know what you're at. We'll talk about that in a few moments, why it's important. The area of rules and regulations is, in my mind, the most dangerous area for associations as far as getting themselves inadvertently into some legal liability. And that's because a lot of associations think it's something that's easier to do than it may otherwise be, and you end up aggrieving people or enforcing your rules and regulations in the wrong way, and you get sued. You can get sued for a lot of things, but I think my experience is rules and regulations tend to bring most of the lawsuits, most of the constructive defect issues. Okay. So, if you want to stay away from Johnson, our lawyer here in Salt Lake, if you want to stay away from us, pay attention for the next 50 minutes, and I hopefully can help you do so. And our 50-minute session here is going to be broken into two parts. The first part is a little bit about how to create rules. The second part is about how to enforce those rules. We're going to try and cram into 50 minutes what I teach for 2 days to professional managers. So another key here is to make sure that you have a manager who knows what they're doing with respect to rulemaking. For purposes of our course today, and in your materials, they talk about restrictions and they talk about rules. The term restrictions in your book, and I don't think that this has to be so, but in your book, restrictions are those things that are contained in your association's governing documents. Your governing document, your declaration may say you cannot have pets in this association, or you cannot have pets over 50 pounds. If that's in your declaration or your bylaws, according to your book, it would be a restriction. Those restrictions that are in your governing documents are often very difficult to change because in order to change your governing documents, you're going to need to have usually consent of the owners, and you're usually going to need a supermajority consent of the owners, and that's difficult to obtain. It's particularly difficult to obtain if you've got an apathetic association. It's almost impossible to obtain if you've got an association of second unit owners. The associations I represent in Park City where they're, somebody's second home, second $1 million home, and they live in the $2 million home in California, you can't get them to care enough about their Park City community that they go to twice a year to go to the meetings. So you can't get 50% there, much less 66%. So you can't. Restrictions are very difficult to change. But the problem is that your restrictions in your governing documents are going to control over your rules if there's some inconsistency. Rules, by contrast to regulations, are going to be adopted generally by your association's governing body. Sometimes referred to as the Board of Trustees, sometimes referred to as the Management Committee, and they're going to be generally the ones who have the ultimate authority to adopt rules. When I talk about adopting rules today, I'm going to try and discourage you from allowing them to be the sole creator of rules in your association. Because of the fact that they're adopted by the board, they're easier to adopt and they're easier to change, which is both good and bad. It's good because you can change them as the community's needs change. It's bad because I've actually seen association boards get removed because of pet policies or the absence of pet policies. So the vagaries of community associations are often displayed in connection with rules. Even though rules are easy to change, you should be careful in considering them and adopting them. And the last thing to address is that they have to be in accord with the higher authorities. And when Peter spoke this morning, I'm presuming, I came in a little bit late, but I'm presuming he went through the hierarchy of documents. Did you go through that, the plat map, the declaration? In connection with evaluating what you can change in your rules, have to consider what are the higher authorities that are going to restrict your ability. The traditional CAI talks about this, talk about your plat map being the most important document as far as the rights and responsibilities of the owners. That's going to set forth what your limited common areas are, what your common areas are, what part of an association the association has control over and can make rules over. Below that is the declaration, covenants, condition, and restrictions, CC&Rs, and below that is your bylaws. So all of these, if there's a conflict in your plat map and your declaration, as Peter mentioned, your plat map's going to control it. If your plat map says something is common area and your declaration says something is not common area, you're going to have to go back to the plat map and figure that out. And this arises commonly in parking issues. The declarant will establish that parking rights are individually owned, but the plat map says they're common area. You see lawsuits arise out of that, or disputes at least. For rule-making purposes, you need to go even a little bit further as to the higher authorities, because you need to make sure that your rules are consistent with federal law and state law and municipal law. There's not a whole lot of federal law that's going to restrict your rule-making authority, but there's one federal law that is very important with respect to rule-making. It's the Federal Fair Housing Act. The Federal Fair Housing Act is going to apply to all your community associations, and it's going to prohibit discrimination based upon race, religion, national origin, and most importantly, as far as your rule-making is concerned, the familial status. Because familial status restrictions in the FHA bring all sorts of business to John and me and other lawyers in the state. Because back in about 1984, they amended the Federal Fair Housing Act to say you can't discriminate against families. And basically, that has been interpreted by the various regulatory authorities to say you can't have a rule that has the effect or consequence of discouraging children or families. So if your association has a sign at the pool that says children must be accompanied by an adult, you are violating the Federal Fair Housing Act. And if the Utah FHA organization finds out about that, they will fine you. And they don't care if you knew about the law or not. They will drag you through a fine process. They will fine you for it. They will make you amend that rule. They'll make you go through training. And it becomes a big issue. So be very generally aware of that. A similar restriction in the Fair Housing Act deals with the disabled. The Fair Housing Act calls them handicapped. The Americans with Disabilities Act calls them disabled. But at any rate, people who need a service animal or companion animal are entitled to have that. So when you get to your pet restrictions, you got to make sure that you allow for service animals and companion animals, and deal with that in advance. We don't have time to talk about those issues today. Just be generally aware of them in connection with your rule-making process. When we talk about creating restrictions and rules, go back to the things that John Richards was talking about today in problem solving. These steps that you're going to go through are similar to the steps you go through in solving many problems in your community associations. The first thing you're going to want to do is identify the scope of the problem. What problem are we having in the association with pets? What exactly are people complaining about with respect to pets? You got to get your hands around that before you can adopt a rule. I sometimes get calls by people that say, we're having problems with pets. We need a pet rule. Can you give me a pet rule? And I, say, well, what are the problems? Well, don't you just have some on your word processor? Yeah, I have about 50 of them on my word processor. Which one do you want? And then they start thinking that maybe there are different issues. So you got to figure out, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about pets because I think pets are probably one of the most common problems you'll encounter, and it's one of the most difficult issues to deal with rulemaking. And I recently had a successful, what I think is a successful process in pet rules, so I'm going to talk about that today. Who should address the problem? In in theory, it's your board that's going to have the authority to make these restrictions. But in practice, it's not necessarily the board that's best at it.